Josh Larson here, editor over at thinkchristian.net. Your host, wishing you a happy fall and a happy Halloween, because there's no such thing as secular. We're coming up on 3 years of doing this show, and that means we've established a couple of traditions. One of those, an annual Halloween episode where we offer a Christian defense of horror. Now, this all stems from a 2015 post I wrote over at thinkchristian.net, leaning on a sermon by Dietrich Bonhoeffer about overcoming fear, which is a Christian call that I believe the good horror movies can help us follow. This year, I'm going to have that thesis challenged, however, by the new horror film Malignant, which is one of the most bonkers I've seen in a while. J.R. Forasteros assures me that he has an intriguing TC take on it. I know there's a ton of theological meat on the bones, so to speak, of 1931's Frankenstein. This is one of my favorites, and it's a film that Sarah Welch Larson recently revisited and wrote about for Bright Wall Dark Room. That was enough of an excuse for me to take another look at it and have her on the show to discuss. Now, this is probably as good a time as any to share some news about an exciting book project that I'm taking on, as it is also Halloween themed. Rem Film has been publishing a Real Spirituality monograph series. Speaking of Sarah, her Becoming Alien book is a part of this. And I'm thrilled to be contributing a book that will be something of a how-to for Christians interested in watching horror, as well as a demonstration of what we can appreciate about some of the horror greats. Now, editorial and publishing deadlines being what they are, and writing being really hard, this is a ways off. Our goal right now is to have it ready and available in time for Halloween 2023. So follow me at Larson on Film on Facebook, Twitter, and Letterboxd for updates on that. I'm going to be logging a ton of horror films over at Letterboxd in the next few months, for sure. Okay, in 1931's Frankenstein, the scientist Henry Frankenstein, we're told, is an expert in chemical galvanism and electrobiology. I invited Sarah Welch Larson on to talk about the movie because her degree is in the very same thing. Sarah Welch Larson has been on a Frankenstein movie binge, at least judging from her viewing diary on Letterboxd. I think you've also tweeted about this, Sarah, but remind me, what prompted you to watch, I think, at least 5 classic Frankenstein movies in the last few weeks?
It's partly my husband's fault. So he gave me a box set of all of the Frankenstein movies for Valentine's Day a few years ago. It's fantastic. It was a great Valentine's Day gift. That was actually before we even got married, and that was one of the further signals that he was a keeper. So. But we'd only watched, he hadn't seen anything other than the original. So I wanted to show him Bride of Frankenstein, and then we both realized it's October. It's time to watch some spooky movies, so we might as well go through the entire box set, because I hadn't seen most of them still either. So we've been working through them in chronological order, and some of them are very bonkers. We're enjoying it. Mm-hmm.
Maybe we'll touch on some of those here before we finish up, but mostly we're going to talk about that original, about the 1931 Frankenstein. This directed by James Whale, stars Colin Clive as Frankenstein and Boris Karloff, the great Boris Karloff as the monster. Now, of course, this is an adaptation of the 1818 Mary Shelley novel, but that's a story, that just demands cinematic interpretation. There are so many visual possibilities in her tale. So tell me, Sarah, what do you love about this very old movie?
Oh, so much. And especially the visuals, they pulled out all of the stops when they made this movie. If I remember right, Universal was kind of in trouble and they needed a big blockbuster movie before blockbusters were a thing. So they decided to just go all out. So the set design is incredible. The makeup is fantastic. Boris Karloff especially is just a wonderfully physical actor. He does so much just with the way that he moves his eyes around, or with the flip of the wrist. He doesn't talk at all in this role. But you can tell that he's thinking things, and you can tell what he's thinking just by the way that he moves. And so that's one of the things that just keeps me coming back to this movie again and again. It's one of my all-time favorites.
I'm with you on the performance. I mean, it's so iconic that I think people haven't seen the movie, only associate it with those scenes where he's kind of moaning or groaning and being monstrous. And that's there. Within the context of the film, though, it's much more sorrowful and sad than it is when taken out of that. And you're so right about the movements. I was thinking about it, it's just his eyes. They're so sad too. The eyes, there's sadness in that. But
Mhm.
the limpness that he has, you really get this sense of a lost soul struggling to kind of move along or drag along this lifeless body. I mean,
Mhm.
somehow he just captures it really well. And the sets, as you mentioned, I mean, this laboratory, pretty much every set we're in, whether it's the houses or some of the like the graveyard scene outdoors, but the laboratory is the main one, right? Where you
It's
have all these
incredible.
spheres, cylinders, who knows what they're all doing, but
Yeah.
they look kind of old-fashioned, almost rudimentary, but also futuristic. I mean, it's just great stuff. So yeah, that was a delight to revisit it and just take in some of those aesthetic elements. Now, you are writing or you're done writing, and it might actually be published by the time this episode airs, but Bright Wall Dark Room has a series of essays, and you wrote one on Frankenstein,
Mhm.
and you brought some theology into that movie with your essay. I got a sneak peek at it. You touched on themes of transgression and transcendence.
Mhm.
Now, I really encourage folks to go read the whole essay. We'll link to it in the show notes. It's really good. But I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit here about how you've seen those two things playing out in this film.
Totally. Yeah, I think when most people think about horror movies, they're thinking about transgression in particular, like the idea of, oh, you're watching something you're not supposed to watch, or you're watching something scary, you're watching people do bad things to each other or just out in the world. So people don't really necessarily go to horror for the transcendent always. But I think that Frankenstein in particular is a movie that is about the idea of trying to transcend one's circumstances. It also just appears to look like a transcendent film, like a lot of very slow, like gentle, patient takes. It's doing a lot of work that other like transcendent filmmakers like Tarkovsky would do later on down the line. But for the most part, these characters are trying to transcend their circumstances and then they end up transgressing instead. So Dr. Frankenstein is trying to become more than human by creating life of his own. But in order to do that, he's robbing graves and he's sewing corpses together and he's isolating himself completely from humanity in an attempt to create life. And then in so doing, he ends up trying to claim God's power for his own. And at that very moment, like he commits blasphemy. Like the line where he says, it's alive, it's followed by this line where he says, now I know what it feels like to be God. And that
Yeah.
line always gives me chills because this is the moment where he really crosses the line. It's not the fact that he's given life to this thing. It's the fact that he has claimed a power for himself that does not belong to him. And he realizes it in that moment. And then he realizes just what a terrible mistake he has made.
Yeah, I forgot that too, watching it again. Everyone knows the "It's Alive" line, but I forgot that it is followed by that crucial one. Obviously, I remember that theme being there. It's kind of almost the most central theme of Shelley's work, but still, the way he just kind of slips that in and states it as a moment, as you said, of self-realization more than anything else. It's a great moment. And it's set up a little bit as well. There's an earlier one where he's talking to Fritz, who is sort of the Igor in this scenario, and saying, describing what he's able to do and how he's able to do it with his hands. And I think he repeats that line too. And looking
Yes.
at his hands, it's like it's dawning on him this power that he feels he's just about to attain.
Think of it, the brain of a dead man, waiting to live again in a body I made with my own hands. With my own hands.
I think too, there's transgression going on here in a different way. Watching it, it struck me again on a revisit. We talk a lot at TC about salvation being something that we can't enact ourselves for ourselves, or we can't earn, right? It only comes by the grace of God. And it struck me that resurrection is distinct from salvation in a lot of ways. It's also something that's not in our power. And that's kind of really what Henry Frankenstein, the Dr. Frankenstein here, is trying to do. He's not really trying to create new life. He kind of talks about it in those terms, but think about even the very first scene we see where he is in the graveyard, right? He and Fritz are waiting for this body to be buried so they can unearth it
Mhm.
and essentially resurrect it. He says something when he's holding the coffin about
Yeah, it's
he's
not dead, it's sleeping,
yeah,
it's waiting to live again.
that's it. Waiting for new life to come. And so that
Mhm.
kind of strikes me as his fundamental transgression here. It's not just that he's trying to be God, but it's more specific almost. He's trying to claim the power of Christ, or at least give that gift of resurrection to someone else. That's what he thinks he can do. And this watch, that struck me as kind of like even more chilling than what I had thought about before, where he's just playing God, quote unquote.
Yeah, and it's a completely graceless approach. I feel like he has decided to shut out other human beings, including his own fiance, in a way that I found quite striking too, because there's this idea of there's grace that is salvation grace, and then there's the grace that is extended to all humanity. And he has cut himself off from all of that all at once as well. And he's trying to exist on his own. You just can't do that and be a fully functioning human being. It just doesn't work that way.
Another element I'd forgotten. Yeah, he's in this abandoned windmill. He's turned into his lab with only Fritz and is so adamant about no one else coming up there to see what he's doing, which again, is kind of an admission of transgression that he's just by conducting himself that way. He acts like they wouldn't understand, or the experiment needs to have this sort of privacy, but it also reveals that he does realize deep down that what he's doing is, as you say, outside of the bounds of society or communal life. So I had a question for you watching it again that
Yes.
I don't know if we can answer, but I thought it was really interesting this time to see that the monster, Frankenstein's monster, is a monster essentially because Fritz steals a quote unquote abnormal brain from the university instead of a normal one. He drops the normal one and so has to go back for the abnormal one that's sitting there on the table. And I realize, that suggests to me at least that the movie is suggesting sin is maybe a matter of biology, which is kind of disturbing and has a lot of implications.
Yeah.
But in the context of this movie, it did make me wonder if Fritz had taken the normal brain, would the experiment have worked? So first of all, do you think it would have played out that way? And if so, what does that mean for this whole idea of Frankenstein trying to claim God's power or claim Christ's resurrecting power?
Well, I think Mary Shelley would have disagreed with the abnormal brain thing because that isn't part of the original story. I think the story would have still played out the same way because the monster is abused by Fritz before it escapes from Frankenstein's lab. And that's kind of treated as the inciting incident, is that the monster lashes out in self-defense, ends up killing Fritz and then escaping, and then going on a rampage around the countryside. And kind of like the book, the monster is misunderstood and therefore also lashes out at everybody else around him. The sequels really play hard into that idea of the monster has an abnormal brain. And therefore, that's what's made it the way that it is. So Bride of Frankenstein to some extent, but all of the other sequels especially talk about how the experiment was imperfect because there was an abnormal brain placed inside. And there's even a subplot in one of the very later sequels where they decide that they want to swap out the monster's brain for a more normal brain to see if that'll make it good. Yeah, it doesn't work out because somebody else with an ulterior motive decides that he wants his brain to live on inside the monster because that will give him unlimited power as well. So the movies definitely are on the side of this is kind of a biological thing. I don't gel with that in the slightest. That feels gross to me in a way. Like the monster is forever condemned to damnation purely because of the brain that was placed inside it. And I don't hold with that. And neither does the original movie, but the sequels really try to play that up.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed out that scene of Fritz. At this point, the monster is chained essentially in the basement of this windmill. And Fritz, who you have to imagine has probably experienced some sort of torment in his own life and kind of is now taking it out at a victim, someone he thinks he can. And you're right, that is an inciting incident that does go against the theory of it just being because of an abnormal brain. So that's really fascinating about the other sequels. The only one I've seen is Bride, which I think is even better than Frankenstein, actually. It's just amazing. But I haven't seen any of the others. So hit me with some of those titles, which I can't recall, but I know that when I see them, I just love hearing these titles. And maybe is there, one that has stood out more to you than the others that if anyone wanted to go past Bride and check one out, is there one you think that's especially worth checking out of those that you've seen?
Son of Frankenstein, which is the one that comes after Bride, is quite good. It's also the longest, weirdly. It's like 90 minutes long, and most of them are in the 60, 70-minute range. Son of Frankenstein's interesting because it really kind of talks a lot about like the sins of the father being placed down multiple generations to his
Mm.
descendants. If you're a fan of Young Frankenstein, you'll also recognize a lot of the plot in Son of Frankenstein as well. Ghost of Frankenstein has a title that absolutely rips, but I'm not a big fan of it because Boris
Okay.
Karloff isn't in it as the monster.
Oh, wow.
And then I just watched Frankenstein versus the Wolfman this past weekend. And it was
Now
more
we're
of a
talking.
Wolfman story than a Frankenstein story. So I wasn't as enamored of it, but I'm curious to see where the rest of the series go. I think Abbott and Costello end up meeting Frankenstein at some point at the end of the
That
40s.
sounds right.
So, yep. Yeah.
All
I
right.
haven't hit that
Well-
one yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
You're almost there. You will soon be a completist. That's very, very exciting.
It's been
Well,
really
thank
fun.
you very much for sharing some of your research with us. We are going to link to that Bright Wall Dark Room, which will hopefully be out by the time this episode airs. And we should probably point out too, Sarah, you have a recent piece at thinkchristian.net on Church's new album, Screen Violence, which I think we could probably say is Halloween themed, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Screen violence deals a lot with 80s slasher movies and treats them as a framework for viewing the way that we treat people in society according to a set of rules that are impossible to live by. And the angle of the album is about women in society especially, but it really does feel like something that applies very much to the church as well. Like if you deal with the world in terms of legalism, then that creates like an impossible situation for someone to live in. And that's one of the things that this album is wrestling with. And it's also just a really, really good album. I like it quite a bit.
You know, I usually try when I'm editing the music pieces to have the album playing in the background as well. And this is one, you know, a good test is after the piece is up and published, if I go back to listen to them still, you know, whether it kind of hits me where I want to be. And this one, yeah, I've been giving some extra spins. So it's a good one. The essay is good as well. So again, that is at thinkchristian.net. If you want to keep up with Sarah on Twitter, you can find her at Dodgy Boffin. And we mentioned Letterboxd. Is that your handle there as well, Sarah?
Yep. I am everywhere online at Dodgy Boffin. Makes me pretty easy to find.
There you go. So look for her on Letterboxd too. Thanks again, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
Ooh, if you had been listening on any of the other podcast platforms, you would have just heard a bit of Bob Dylan's wonderfully creepy My Own Version of You, a languid, sauntering take on what it might be like to stitch a bunch of body parts together in a midnight cemetery. No one, in my opinion, has had his finger on the pulse, or lack thereof, of human mortality better than Dylan, and isn't that really what lies at the cold heart of terror? Hello, I'm John J. Thompson, and if you've been with us for a while, you may remember my previous Defense of Horror playlists. Well, I've added a slew of new songs to last year's lists, including cuts from Nick Cave, Blitzen Trapper, the Leuven Brothers, Judah and the Lion, Chance the Rapper, and more. There's even some cool movie score stuff, including cuts from Malignant and Candyland. As always, the mix can be found by searching Spotify for the Think Christian profile or just finding the link on our website. If you've got a song suggestion for me, write it on a candy wrapper and tweet it to me at John J. Thompson. Then ring my doorbell and run down the street. I'll see what I can do. Until next time, this is JJT reminding you that if you hear footsteps behind you as you walk that lonely road tonight, just put some headphones on and turn up the music. Then you won't hear the footsteps anymore. Peace.
J.R. Forsteros is here to talk Malignant, a new horror movie directed by James Wan that's been causing jaws to drop the past few weeks due to this third act reveal. And right away, I'm going to say we're going to give plenty of warning before we do any spoiler talk in this conversation. But because the movie was causing a lot of fuss, I thought we should talk about it on the show. And when I ran the idea past you, JR, do you remember what you said?
I said, I've been waiting for this day my whole life.
You did, yes. So what does that mean? Does that mean you're a huge fan of Malignant? Does it mean you think the movie's reveal is just so much fun that you need to talk about with somebody? Or do you think there's really some good theological stuff to dig into here?
So both and. I mean, one, I just love the TC Christian Defense of Horror episodes in general, and I've been champing at the bit to get to be on. But we have so many great horror minds in the TC community that, you know, I knew I had to wait my turn. So, but you know, okay, so we are in an age of art house horror where I think the meanings and the metaphors are all really potent. I mean, even right now, I'm wearing my Black Phillip shirt from The Witch. That whole A24 movement, even stuff outside A24, like Hereditary, you know, all of that stuff. when talking heads like us want to sit down and discuss like the sociological impact of horror and stuff like that, it comes really easily in that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're a horror fan, you also know that like the vast majority of content that is produced under the horror banner is like not art house horror. It is the grindhouse B, C, and D level movie stuff. It's just much less obvious that there's any redeeming value in that kind of stuff.
In the pure genre stuff.
Right. I mean, going all the way back to like Sam Raimi's Evil Dead stuff, right? Where it's just like really splattery and gross and exploitative and all that kind of stuff. And Malignant very much falls into that second category. I mean, it is B horror made with an A budget with an all-star director, but it is so much a love letter to horror. So much so that I think if someone is coming off of either direction, if they're coming out of the art house stuff and they're expecting something like deep and meaningful, they're going to be really surprised. Also, though, I think if they're coming from James Wan's PG-13 Conjuring verse movies, they're going to be really shocked in a completely different way by this, because this is very much a hard R splatter flick.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm a fan of The Conjuring, but it's exactly really for the things this is not, which are like the low-key craftsmanship, haunted house sort of scares. And this, you're right, things split and splatter in this movie. I think we can say. Which again, I think body horror is, which is going on here, is a rich subgenre to explore as well. Let's give some of the basic plot. And again, without spoilers at this point, but the movie is basically following a pregnant wife played by Annabelle Wallis, who experiences these visions of this long-haired, trench coat-wearing figure who commits grisly murders. And then it turns out that this isn't the twist, but it turns out these murders are revealed to have taken place in real life. So she's trying to figure out what is going on. The police are involved, start investigating, and everyone's kind of confused as to how she has seen these things that have actually happened, what that might mean. So where it goes from there, I had to invent a new word when I wrote about this, JR, bazonkers, because I could have not in any way fathomed where this thing goes. I think, interestingly, in retrospect, and it did seem like a clue to me at the time, but it didn't lead me to any answer. In that figure, how that figure is portrayed and even moves, let's just say, is some really ingenious clue dropping that the movie is doing. But yeah, other than that, I had no idea. I will say I am a fan of some of the more genre stuff, but I don't know that this works overall as just a pure horror movie too well, for me at least. The scares are pretty standard. The dialogue is dreadful. The performances are all over the place. Let me get your reaction just on that level before we really dig in. As one of these kind of B-Z movie genre pictures, how did it work for you?
So I have two kind of basic reactions. I think that, as you just said, this film trades almost entirely on the big reveal. I remember reading a couple of spoiler-free reviews before I watched Malignant that said, basically, this movie is meh, and then it's not. And once it's not, it's really not. I find, and this is such a difficult thing to do, reveals work the best for me when once it's revealed, it feels obvious. But before it's revealed, I could have guessed 100 times and never hit it.
Yeah.
And that's very much so to your point, right? Like once you know what's going on with the figure's movement, you're like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
But before that, it's right there in front of your face, but you'd never guess what's happening.
Yep. That's fair.
And so I thought that was super effective. I think that's also why so many people have responded so positively to it, And the direction is incredible. There's a God shot early in the film as Maddie is walking through the house that gives you some of the architecture of the house that is then paid off like a half hour later when a character, I'll try to avoid spoilers, interacts in a particular way with the architecture of the house. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
I do.
It was set up in this very Wan style piece of direction. And it wasn't just glitz and glam and showing off. It was a very calculated piece of camera movement. So there's so much of the movie that's so smart. But yeah, man, the characters are so one-dimensional. None of the dialogue makes any sense. Like it's such a strange movie that's why I almost feel like Juan is like doing it on purpose to pay homage to these old B movies. But I agree with you that it doesn't really work for me. So I feel like I'm almost giving the movie two different grades, because there's so much that's amazing and then so much that really doesn't work for me.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I think you make the main point that matters, which is that the reveal pays off not just because it surprises us, but because it is woven into most of what we saw before. So I'd agree on that. And there's also, I mean, it's just a great horror idea. For me, if it's not a great horror film, what we find out is a great horror idea. So let's talk about that and the implications of the idea. And this is where we will have to get into spoilers. So if any listeners have not seen Malignant and don't want to know what happens, skip ahead a few minutes. If you have no intention of seeing Malignant, but you want to know what all this craziness is that we're talking about, this is your chance to find out, I guess. So yeah, let's break this down, JR. Tell us about Gabriel.
Yeah, so we find out that Maddie had a twin in utero that was almost entirely absorbed into her. And this is a phenomenon that happens. Sometimes people have like a vestigial arm or there's like a little pocket of teeth or something like that kind of manifests as a non-malignant tumor that can just get removed. But what we find here is that Gabriel is present enough that he is a presence on the back of her head. Like he's sticking out of the back of her head. And when she was young, she was put into a special clinic to try to help her. And Gabriel manifested inexplicably some electronic powers, like he could talk through radios and he could sort of manipulate electricity a little bit. And so because he would not behave himself, they basically tried to cut off as much of him as they could and then buried the rest in her brain. And so what's happening in the film is he is taking over her body and then moving what we would say is backwards, but to him it's forwards because he's, looking out of the back of her head. And that's the herky-jerky movement of this character. And then she doesn't know what's happening, right? She's like locked out of her own brain. I would love, Josh, to hear you talk about it because you wrote in your review about what Juan does with the actual reveal itself.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of the filmmaking. And maybe just to clarify, the reason she doesn't know this is she's mostly forgotten about it. It's kind of buried this trauma we're meant to understand. And when we first meet her, she is married and her husband is abusive.
That's right.
There's a very intense scene where he ends up slamming her head against a wall in their house. And we're meant to understand later that kind of ruptured something in the back of her head, which allowed Gabriel, I think someone says at some point, woke him up in some way. And yes, how you described it is true, but I think you left off and when we see him as a child finally, and her as a child, Gabriel has arms. There are almost like these stick arms. So this is not we're not talking about Harry Potter here. Yeah. where it's like Voldemort's face on the back of who's a Quirrell's head. I'm probably going to get that wrong. And now I'm in big trouble. This is like a body that's almost on the back of her as a child. And what Juan does to reveal this, you talked about the bold strokes he makes, and he does. In The Conjuring, they're maybe a little more muted, though really ingenious. I think he did Furious 7 as well, one of the Fast and Furious movies. Very bold filmmaking strokes here. And this is just so audacious because it's a flashback to we're looking at Maddie as a girl sitting on a table in the hospital, and the movie just swings around to her back where is suddenly like Gabriel, kind of like Frosty the Snowman with his little stick arms. And this kind of speaks to what you were talking about, how he may be leaning into the Z movie elements like bad dialogue intentionally. I don't know that the effects here are all that impressive or convincing. We only get little glimpses, but I do wonder if that's part of the point too, is we want this to kind of look like we didn't have a huge budget because I'm making something that's a no budget movie. But I don't know. What was your impression of when you fully saw Gabriel?
Oh yeah. I mean, so it's all practical. right? Like we understand
which
that
I
that
love.
little girl had, that's like so classic B horror, right? I mean, again, you're talking about low budget, no budget. So they just find some Caro syrup and then they get a friend that has some modeling clay or something, right? And they just build so everything's like sticky and oozy and it's almost like you can feel it through the screen. And so you very much get that. I think it's Hitchcock's rules of horror, right? Is never show the monster. What you leave to your imagination is always scarier than what you see. And so I love that, we get it. Like we know what's going on once he shows us.
Yeah.
But then especially once they cut off his arms and cut out most of his, vestigial body and then literally just like push him into her cranium and seal up the skull. It's the face Josh. If you're not watching, if you're only listening, you need to go watch for the face Josh is making. That's how we all feel while it's happening. We're like, it's so gross.
Yes.
Yeah, it's meant to be horrific. And then again, we understand how the blow to the head on the wall makes that happen. And the clues that every time she wakes up from one of these visions, her pillow has blood on it, that she, for some reason, never decides to go get checked out, right? It's really effective and I think horrifying us.
Yeah. It's deeply disturbing for sure. Even if it doesn't look entirely convincing, it's disturbing.
Right. And I think for me, that was one of the spaces where I started to resonate with the film because as much as we all roll our eyes at the idea that she had, she's bleeding from the head and not getting it checked out or whatever, when we start to understand that like this sort of like head space and head pain is something that she's probably experienced for a lot of her life and for a lot of her early life, there was some pain there. We all have scars or pains that we've lived with for so long, we just kind of ignore them, that other people don't. And so, when they find out about it or they ask about it or something like that, we're like, oh yeah, that, I don't know, and that was what I started to recognize about the film. I mean, and again, I try not to, with these B movies, try not to dig too much into the meaning, but I was really struck by the idea that so much of Maddie's trauma came from the fact that this particular pain in her past, everyone just tried to bury it and ignore it and forget it, even though it wasn't gone, even though it was still present within her. And it's not until at the end of the film, she basically says, hey, this is mine. And you can't have it anymore, and owns it and claims it and comes to terms with it, that she can have any power over it. As an evangelical, I grew up Southern Baptist and I'm Nazarene now. And we, in our effort to distance ourselves from our Catholic siblings, we abandoned the art of confession, And so I think a lot of us are not taught what it looks like to have this kind of collective space to confess trauma and to confess sin so that it can be healed, even though that's something that Jesus very clearly says in the scriptures, bring things into the light so that the truth can be known. And, the one who is, James says, confess your sins to one another, that you can be healed. But I think we're taught so often just to keep these things silent and locked away and hidden. And when they do that, they do become malignant, not to turn on the title of the film, but, they grow, they spread their rot and their sickness. Yeah. And I just really liked that the sort of the solution at the end of the film was not someone else rescuing her, but it was her coming to terms with who she is, accepting that, and then understanding that that did not have to define her, And again, it didn't go all the way. We don't see like a sanctification kind of a moment with Gabriel, right? But I don't think we have to for that to really resonate with me.
No, I don't think so either. And, when a title is chosen like Malignant, it immediately, I mean, there's even an early scene with a doctor saying it's time to take the cancer out, right? So the movie is opening itself up to metaphorical readings. And I think some of these B movies can be almost more open to that because they're not necessarily concerned with delivering any sort of thematic or moral message that some of the art house horror may be, which again, I appreciate as well. But when they're open-ended like this in a B movie, a genre movie, you don't know where it's going to take you. And when the experience of watching the movie can be somewhat traumatic on a much lesser level, but still like that's going to provoke some things. That's going to, take your mind some places. And so I think you did it. I think you made the TC turn with Malignant. And and argue that it does deserve a spot on this Defense of Horror episode. One of the, details is that Maddie is adopted as a child from the hospital, and her adoptive family is not told about any of this. So it kind of speaks to what you're saying is you touched on both of them, but there's two ways to think about it. One is as sin that needs to be confessed. And the other is as trauma you've experienced that needs to be expressed, maybe, which is different, right? It can't be suppressed. It needs to be brought, before God and brought before therapy and brought before, all the tools that God has given us to work through such trauma and take that sort of ownership or understanding that you talk about, which the movie definitely brings Maddie to at some point. So yeah, I like where you went. I think it works, even though I'm pretty sure most people involved in making Malignant probably had no intention of going there. But that's what we do, right?
That's right. That's right.
Mom and Dad took me in when I was 8. I don't remember anything before that. Mom told me that my biological mother died during my birth. Sydney, I'm adopted.
So you sold me, JR. I don't know if I ever want to think about Gabriel again after this conversation, but
Until Malignant 2, right?
What's that?
Until Malignant 2, right?
Oh man. I mean, how's it doing? I haven't noticed. Has it been doing enough business where we're going to get that?
Well, one, I don't think it costs that much money.
Probably
right?
not.
Like, I mean, a lot of the Conjuring verse movies are made on the cheap. All I've seen is the critical acclaim, which it's, horror movies that get like above a 50% on Rotten Tomato, I consider to be pretty critically acclaimed. And I think this one's doing like really, I mean, again, everyone sort of has the same reaction we did where they're like, look, this is gross, but that turn, man, you got to see it.
Yeah. Yep.
So I would be surprised if Juan wants to make another one, that he wouldn't get to.
Yeah. Well, and part of the wrinkle there too is this has had, as most movies do these days, kind of a strange release pattern. So it was released on HBO Max and in theaters, but from what I understand, it was only going to be on HBO Max until October 10. Now we're recording this in advance of that, so we don't know. It may have left already, that service, but it might still be in theaters. So I would think they're going to want to make it available in some way in the weeks leading up to Halloween. So if you haven't seen, right? I mean, it makes, if you're going to put this out, it's now. So yeah, hopefully you have a chance, if we've convinced you that it's worth giving Malignant a try, you have a chance of seeing it in one of those ways, at least before Halloween here. So thank you, JR. I'm glad to have you on to do this Defense of Horror episode.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah.
Enjoy your Halloween, all right?
Happy Halloween to you as well.
All right, thanks. Well, that's another Halloween episode in the books. For you horror fans, I hope it gave you a lot to chew on. For those of you new to the ways that scary movies can help us process our darkest fears in the light of the gospel, thanks for listening along. If we encouraged you to dip your toes into terror and horror, I would say start with something like 31's Frankenstein and then maybe gradually work your way towards Malignant. Thanks to J.R. Forasteros and Sarah Welch Larson for coming on the show to talk about those two films. On Twitter, you can find them at J.R. Forasteros and at Dodgy Boffin. You can also connect with us on Twitter and on Facebook at Think Christian. And if you have any thoughts about the show that you want to send our way, go ahead and email them to tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net. Now, for our YouTube viewers, you missed out on a couple of tracks from John J. Thompson's Spotify playlists he selected to accompany this episode. Those included a selection from the new Candyman score and a relatively new Bob Dylan song that has a very Frankenstein vibe. So if you want to hear those, go ahead and search for the Think Christian playlist on Spotify. Think Christian Podcast is a listener-supported program of Reframe Ministries, a family of programs designed to help you see your whole life reframed by God's gospel story. Visit reframeministries.org for more information. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor is John Reeder, and Reframe's co-director overseeing content strategy is Robin wrestling. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks to talk about how another aspect of our pop culture fandom connects with our faith.